Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. We finally get to the end of the journey of the heroic parent, and we're talking about Chapter 9, The Myths of Being Right. And I think in a lot of ways, the end of this book became a jumping off point for me for the second book, which we already did a review of. But as I think about presenting this evening about Chapter 9, The Myths of Being Right, I think about how the fundamental idea that I think about these days is how much we're trying to be good, trying to be right, trying to be worthy, and that our defenses are organized in such a way as to protect us from being bad, being wrong, not being enough. And that if we think we can achieve some kind of a level of rightness, some level of goodness, then we have eluded the problem, when in essence we've just kept it at bay. Because the reality is that the goal, the ideal, is to become a whole person, which means a person who makes mistakes, which means a person who has limited patience and limited capacity. Recently, I was talking to a client of mine about this idea of letting somebody in his life, somebody in an extended family member that he was at odds with. And as we were discussing it, he was lamenting the fact that he didn't have enough capacity, enough patience, that he was unable to hold space for this person. And it's not like this person was particularly unkind. It was just that their personality constantly rubbed against him, and he tried everything in his skill set to be able to hold boundaries with this person. But as he was talking about this, he said, maybe if I keep doing therapy, maybe if I keep working, I'll develop enough capacity that they can be in my life in such a way that it doesn't cost me so much. And what I said to him was, the end result of you developing as a person might mean that you might not have this person in your life, that you actually might not, you might set a boundary where they're not welcome in your home or in your life, or you might not talk to them. And so I think a lot of times we think, because, and I think sometimes I don't intend this, but I sometimes lead people to believe that if we get to the end of this path, whatever it is, that we'll have all capacity and all patience for other people. And really, it's about getting to a place where you can be who you are. And that's the goal, as I see it in therapy, is to be who you are, to be a person, to be a human being. And what we're trying to teach the children in our program, the adolescent and young adult children in our program, is we're trying to help them grapple with the dilemma of being a human being and being a person. So that's the preface, if you will, to tonight's broadcast as I get into it. Starting off with the epigraph for the chapter 9. Rather than possessing an internal sense that we are enough, we try to be right, to mask the vulnerability of owning it, which leaves us alone on a psychological island by ourselves. It's a very difficult place to just be ourselves, without the crutch, if you will, of being right or good or enough. And so the transition that we are facilitating and asking families to make in this process is really to let go of the things that have propped them up their entire life. And I think as parents, we believe that we're supposed to know things, to have answers for things, kind of be somewhat of the experts in life so that we can pass on that wisdom to our children. And in this way of being, what we're talking about tonight, really the goal is to be human, which is at times to not have answers and to not have it all figured out, and to still be grappling with our own humanity. I read a quote this weekend on social media where somebody was talking about this idea that as we grow up, we're also watching our parents grow up also. And we don't know that. We still have an idea that they have arrived, or they're at least in some much greater position than we are. And while they have more miles on the car, so to speak, they're farther along, they still are grappling. We still are grappling as parents with what it means to be a person, what it means to be a human. And so sometimes with the awakening that comes with this kind of work, you can experience a great deal of grief and loss and sadness, even depression, because you don't have the what I think is the illusion. You've lost the illusion that you can get it right and have it all figured out and have all the answers. Furthermore, I read in the chapter, the goal is to connect to yourself, find yourself, and to be okay with yourself so you can allow your children to do the same. The greatest thing in the world is to be seen and acknowledged by another. Because when you're truly seen by somebody, then there's a chance you can find yourself. You can find yourself. Jessica Benjamin put it this way: recognition is that response from the other which makes meaningful the feelings, intentions, and actions of the self. The greatest contribution we can make to our children is to be able to see them and resonate with them. And out of that seeing and that resonating, combined with our own sense of self, what we need, what we feel okay with, what we can tolerate. You kind of mix those ingredients up, and what comes out of the oven, so to speak, is the decision. The decision about whether or not to send your child to a program like ours, whether or not to take, which program to go to afterwards, to take your child home. What is the curfew? How much screen time is there? And because those answers come out of this thing that we call being a person and seeing the other person, I can't tell you what to do. In my opinion, real, authentic psychotherapy doesn't involve telling you the right way to live and the right way to be. I can't be sure of it anyway, and it's too great of a responsibility for you to defer to me or to any therapist, and it's too great of a responsibility for me to take on. So like I talk about at length, which really becomes the thesis for the second book, the shift is away from being right to being a person. And in this way of thinking, you don't get to be right anymore, but you do get to be a person, to be a self. And that is so much better, so much more liberating, so free. A lot of people ask the question, will my being right prevent my child from struggling? I give the example in the book where folks ask about, for example, should I quit drinking because my child is struggling with substance abuse disorder? And what I say is, if you're drinking too much, if drinking is a problem for you, then absolutely exploring the cessation of drinking is a worthwhile pursuit. But there's no clear, simple cause and effect that if you get it right or become a good enough parent, that your child will turn out the way that you want. I mean, so many of us have come to terms honestly and courageously with how limited our parents were. But at some point, like somebody once said to me, there's an expiration date on blaming your parents and waiting for them to change and figure it out. And you've got to live your life. You've got to deal with the wounds, the dents, the bruises that you experienced. So no, you can't get it right enough. And I've seen parents try to get it right so much and then end up resentful that their children are still making mistakes, are still experiencing setbacks and detours and so forth. But it's that moment when they express or experience that resentment that we find the problem, right? That feeling arises from a misunderstanding about the nature of relationships between parents and children. You are not in control, right? If you were in control, you wouldn't be listening to me right now. If you were in control, you wouldn't, evoke therapy programs wouldn't exist. Our wilderness programs for adolescents and young adults wouldn't exist because you would have found a way to help your children be successful. Most of the parents I work with are very great problem solvers, have been successful in many areas of life. And so if it was up to them, they wouldn't be in this predicament. One question to ask yourself is, why do you need to be right? In my experience, our drive to be right stems from growing up in a context where that was the thing to be. You had to justify yourself, your life, your choices. Your feelings weren't enough. My feelings weren't enough. It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough just to be Brad. I had to be right. And so we argued over who was right and who was wrong growing up. And when you get cooked in that soup, then of course you pass that same idea onto your children. But if you grew up in a family like the ones you guys are now transforming into, if you grow up in a family where being a person is the most important thing, then you won't need to be right. You won't end up in situations, relationships, jobs where you have to be right. You'll end up in places where it's good for you. And if you need to leave a relationship, a situation, if you need to rethink your career, your philosophy, that will be okay because that's part of the human experience. So part of what we're trying to do is unlearn what we learned from our family of origin or our earlier context. It wasn't just our parents. They're the usual suspects, if you will, but it's our culture. It's everywhere. Every day I'm talking to people of all ages about the pain of being who they are in relationships and how they get told what to do. I cannot tell you how often I am told by clients that the people in their lives have advice for them about what they should do. And I always find that fascinating because I'm a therapist trained with a doctoral degree in psychology and human behavior. And I don't know what you should do. And if I, whose business it is to understand what it means to be a human being, doesn't know what you should do, how does the person next to you, your aunt, know what you should do? Or your father, your mother, your friend, your spouse know what you should do? One thing that I see happens in families is that it's easy to look at the wrongness of your spouse, right? The idiocy of your spouse, the flaws, the wounds, the defenses that your spouse carries around. And the farther they are away from health and well-being, of course, the easier it is to focus on them. But we learn in recovery, we learn in therapy that we focus on what we can control, and that to obsess about changing another, whether it be our child or our co-parent, is to fall into a trap where our mental health is compromised. I have an entire broadcast on co-parenting where I talk about this, but at this point in this broadcast, what I'll just say is, if you obsess about, if you focus on your co-parent, you've already lost. If you focus on controlling or changing them, it's the same problem as controlling or changing a child. You can only set your boundaries. You can only speak and live as close to your truth as possible. And it is tempting. And I will tell you, I might get asked this question for later on, but one of the most difficult questions I get asked is about unhealthy co-parents or co-parents who are unwilling to do their own work, unwilling to listen to these broadcasts, to read the books, the assignments, to go to therapy, to go to 12-step groups, all the things that we encourage parents to do. And the reason that that's such a difficult situation is because it is a disadvantage in parenting. It is fighting a battle with one hand tied behind your back. But what's worse than having a co-parent who's unhealthy is having two parents that are unhealthy. And if you become obsessed with trying to change and control your co-parent, whether that be an ex-spouse or even the spouse that you're still married to and still love, if your emphasis becomes on changing them, then you are in your disease. You are in a hole with them. I love this story about giving advice. In fact, I just had to attend a wedding this weekend, or at least a luncheon for a relative, and they had at one point friends of the bride and the groom, somebody in my family. They had their friends giving anecdotes and stories, and my wife and I were reflecting with our immediate family on a wedding many years ago that we went to where people were invited to give advice to the bride and the groom. And one of the most common pieces of advice is don't go to bed angry. But this older gentleman stood up and said, if you're not fighting with each other, then one of you is an idiot. Kind of the contrary in some ways to don't go to bed angry. Don't go to bed angry means that you have to arrive at consensus. You have to be on the same page. That there's a time stamp on reconciling. Not going to bed angry or holding that as some ideal could lead to the most unhealthy dynamics I could possibly imagine. It could lead to escalated conflict. It could lead to somebody compromising who they are in their position. It usually leads to a kind of interaction that's fed by the fight or flight of one or both of the partners. So it's okay to go to bed angry. It's okay. In fact, it's recommended. It's just another example of one of the limitless numbers of things that we teach and talk about in our culture and that have been passed down by generations. And it's insane. It's ridiculous. Tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about a little more about to share or not to share feelings, when and why. I get asked this so often. In fact, one of our therapists asked me about it this weekend. It's okay to share your feelings. It's okay to get clear. Who do you share them with? What's your purpose? Are you trying to get somebody to take them on, to be responsible? Do you tell your children that you're upset or scared or sad or disappointed so that they will change their behavior so you don't feel those things? Are you explicitly or implicitly making other people responsible for your feelings? Same with your spouse, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your partner. Are you telling people how you feel to get clear, to own it, to get it off your chest so that you don't act it out in some way? Or are you saying it with the unconscious or conscious expectation that the other person is supposed to take that information and change their behavior and do what you're asking? I don't know if I even have to make a case for this, but everybody listening to my voice, whether live or on the podcast, it's easy to understand and to know that it's crazy to believe that what one person feels is somebody else's responsibility to fix or to carry. It doesn't matter if you love your spouse. It doesn't matter if you love your child. Your serenity, your well-being is your responsibility. And if you come to the people that you care about or even have responsibility for or over and tell them how you feel for the purpose of trying to get them to change, you're engaging in the problem that we're treating in our program. I want to say that as clearly as I can. The problem that we are treating in our program, in part, with everybody that we treat, including your children, it includes, in part, the idea that people are responsible for other people's happiness and serenity and well-being. Yes, kind people are kind and empathic. Yes, a healthy person is sensitive and understanding of others. is aware of the impact of their behavior on those that they care about and those around them, their contribution to dynamics. All of that is true. But at a fundamental level, and I don't know if I've ever said this in this context, in these broadcasts, we are treating at Evoke therapy programs, and I think virtually every program that exists, every therapeutic program that exists, we are treating, in fact, the idea, the behavior, the dynamic that people believe that their feelings are somebody else's responsibility. So as we grow in this process, we learn to sit on that island by ourselves and to feel that what we're feeling. Now, I say by ourselves, but I think people always ask me all the time, how do you do this work? And my answer is, you got to find one person, at least. More is better, but at least one person that can hear and see you, can understand you. They can see your strengths, your gifts, the miracle of you. And they can also see your disaster, your mistakes, your weaknesses, your fears, the things that you're ashamed of or were taught to be ashamed of. And they can embrace and hold them all with love and patience and compassion. So yeah, sharing feelings is an important part of a healthy life. But who do you say them to? And why are you saying them? Are perhaps more important to consider than the format that we give you, for example. Ultimately, I think a lot of this, when we give up being right, we start to model the strength of our vulnerability, of our humanness, of our humanity. I don't think this cartoon that I borrowed that I've just put up on the screen is from this chapter. It's from earlier in the book. And I've stated it a couple of times as I've been reviewing the book. But it shows a couple of parents with, looks like the father's holding a large textbook behind his back while speaking to their young son. And they're saying to him, don't you realize, Jason, that when you throw furniture out the window and tie your sister to a tree, you make mommy and daddy very sad. This is kind of the apex of making somebody else responsible for your feelings. But back to modeling strength and vulnerability. You know, everybody knows this that's listening to this. Being able to cry is a strength. Being able to not know is a strength. Sitting in your confusion and you're not knowing is a strength. It requires confidence. It requires some kind of esteem, right? Self-esteem. To embrace and sit with those imperfect parts of you. And that's what your children need from us and from you. That's what your partner would thrive under or with. Is the understanding that they're imperfect, they're fallible, they have limits. Some parents ask the question about forgiveness. When should I forgive? When's the right time to forgive? I've decided, and in this chapter I explained, to take that question and pull it apart and really shift it dramatically. There's no right time. It's possible to forgive somebody. Some people forgive people who have done horrendous things. Some people are very unforgiving of other people with only the slightest of offenses. So my shift is not about that. The question is never, should you forgive or when's the right time to forgive, or it's just owning it. Forgiveness is like a feeling of hurt. It's like asking me, when should I stop feeling hurt? When should I start trusting? The very fact that the word should exists in those sentences is really a problem. But even if we exclude the word should, when's the right time? When's the healthy time? The fact of the matter is you forgive when you're ready, when you're able. And when you're not, you own it. You own both of it. Some people find forgiveness easier. Some people find it more difficult. And that probably ties back to their own history and their own family of origin wounding. So to apply a should or a right way to it doesn't make any sense. There's just work to be done. I write in this chapter, artificially letting go and forgiving because you feel that you should or because you think you must can be a dangerous thing for both you and your child. The shift is just to own it. You can when you can. You do it when you can. And you try not to do it because of these external factors, because it's the right thing, and to fake it. Proving, justifying, and explaining for your boundaries is a sign of being right. The shift, and I've talked about this on a couple of different chapters, is to, this is what I feel comfortable with, this is what I don't. Here's my limit. And it's a life process. I think I've shared at this point, I have a 28-year-old son, and my youngest of 4 is 13, and we're still learning it. We're still finding a way to grow in this area. The minute you justify yourself, you've lost. I teach therapists, don't confront justification when a child or a parent does it. Notice it. They're telling something to you about their background. The goal in therapy is to not stop people from justifying. The goal as a parent is to not stop your child from justifying, or your spouse, or even yourself. The goal is to be in a safe enough place, to be safe enough yourself, that people don't feel the need to justify. Justifying is the defense against the fear of being wrong or bad or unlovable. Arguing or debating. One of the things that I can tell you is that my children are, a couple of them especially, are expert debaters. And what that tells me is I've been doing it with them. I've been trying to be right. This chapter, more than any chapter, if you asked me, Brad, what's your greatest struggle with anything you teach? It would be this chapter. I'm so passionate about this chapter, about the myth of being right, the myths of being right, because it's the one that I struggle with the most. And when my 13-year-old gives me this wonderful, articulate defense or position on a certain rule or boundary, it's feedback to me that I'm the one who taught her that. Laughing at yourself, not taking yourself too seriously, these are signs of not holding on tightly to the idea of being right. The enlightened folks can laugh at themselves. The enlightened folks know that they're idiots, numbskulls, right? It doesn't work very much at work. If you're a neurosurgeon, this stuff is hard to apply. But as a person, it makes sense. Trying to be a good parent. I write about this. Every time I write about this, and I try to reduce the amount of words to fit it into what's allowed in a decent Instagram post or a tweet, the nuance is lost. When I'm talking about being a good person, a good parent, and the myth of trying to be a good parent, I'm saying sometimes you do good things and sometimes you do bad things. Sometimes you're inspired and enlightened, and sometimes you're ridiculous, and sometimes you're defensive, and sometimes you're wounded. And when you learn to embrace and accept all of those parts of yourself, you give permission for the people in your life to be who they are too. That means your children can be angry or sad at you, and it's okay. It makes sense because you're a human being, and that's what happens when we're in a relationship to human beings. So when I'm talking about being a good parent, I'm talking about being only a good parent or a perfect parent, right? When the goal in this work is just to be a human parent. Trying to make them feel anything. I get questions constantly from parents that say, how do I make them feel? How do I, and right when they finish that, before they even get to the next phrase, I say, you're already off track. You can't control how they feel. You cannot control whether or not somebody feels loved. You can only love them. You can't control whether or not somebody trusts you. You can only be trustworthy. You can't control a child's self-esteem. You can just control seeing them and understanding and resonating with them. And so it's a very nuanced thing between control for outcomes and just being the best you can be in a given moment. You can't make them feel. I think most of us grew up in a world where our opinion isn't good enough. We see that all over the world. Right now, we see that in our culture. That it wasn't okay just to feel and have the opinion that you have. My daughter was asking my brother, because he was in town for the wedding, what foods he didn't like, and he mentioned that he didn't like mushrooms, which now has become somewhat of a favorite topic in our family, and even in the work that I do, about how much I hate mushrooms. And my adult daughter was saying, that's so interesting. I don't like mushrooms. My dad, Brad, doesn't like mushrooms. You don't like mushrooms. And she said, is there anything else you don't like? And he said, I think that's about it. And then she named something else that I didn't like. And he said, oh, yeah, that too. I hate that too. And my daughter laughed and chuckled. It was just a light moment. She said, I guess it might be genetic. And I find that we have to defend ourselves about what we like and what we don't like, because we grew up in a world where we had to be right. But we learn to speak relatively. I feel, I think, I believe, I want, I prefer, I dislike, I can't, I can, I'm willing, I'm not willing. When you learn to speak relatively in those ways, in those I statement ways, not just I feel, but I prefer, I like, I want, I need, you learn to be a person. Instead of speaking objectively, like, this is the way that it is. I'm a dog person, not a cat person. And if I were making fun of this sensibility, I would tell you all the reasons why dogs are better than cats. But we know that that's silly. We know that to like dogs, to prefer dogs over cats, doesn't make you one thing or another, better or worse. It's just like liking mushrooms. So we learn and try to model being a self, being a person. I know it sounds simple, and for those of you that are new, it probably sounds confusing, but my goal is to teach, to model, and to develop as a human being, to teach people how to be a human being, how to be human, how to be a person. We learn to listen without judgment, but still have boundaries. You can think that it's okay to go out and experiment with substances, and I can still have boundaries around it. You can stay up. You can think it's okay to stay up, but I can still feel uncomfortable with it. I still get to be me. You don't have to agree. And listening doesn't mean endorsing or agreeing, but we don't know that. We don't act like that. We think. I cannot tell you how many parents have told me over the years how just listening to somebody will implicitly endorse what they're saying. And that's only because you grew up in a family where people had to argue until somebody came out the victor in the argument. But the fact of the matter is you can just hear. It's kind of a big shift. I've told the story where my young daughter, who was much younger at the time, was complaining that our 120-pound Rottweiler wasn't allowed on the couch. And after me empathizing with her and saying, it's totally unfair, isn't it? It's a big bummer. She looked at me and she said, so he can get on the couch? And I said, no, he can't. But the fact that she interpreted my listening as condoning or supporting her position, it shows you what we've done in our family, doesn't it? So as we get out of our own context, as we grow, there'll be some growing pains in that process. And as we shift, this being one of them, as we shift, there'll be misinterpretations or betrayals of the old way of thinking. So as you start to listen to people and not debate or not argue or not justify your position, they will often interpret that as agreement. And it will take a little while for them to learn this new way, that you're learning how to be in relationship to somebody else where they and you both matter and get to be separate. You know, the foundation of the work, kind of our work as we, before we had children, is to develop a sense of self, who we are. Not right or good, but just who we are, what we can tolerate, what we're okay with. Like this client that I described who was debating whether or not somebody should be in their life. It can be a healthy thing to say, I can't. I was saying to my publisher, I had a conversation with her a couple of weeks ago, and I was explaining this idea to her, and I said, you stay in a relationship with somebody in a loving way until you can't. And believe me, because of this idea of being right is so pervasive, so drilled into us, people come to me as a therapist and saying, can I get a divorce? My response is, you can get a divorce anytime you want. Well, is it right? Am I justified? And I said, I don't know. When you feel like you need a divorce, you're allowed to. And if you can stay and be okay enough and be loving to that person, then you stay. But I don't decide that. I don't know what that line is. I can't answer those questions for you. Same with you as a parent. I can definitely have a conversation with you to explore what's going on for you and what's happening inside of your head. But I can't answer those questions. It's not my job. And that's regardless of whether or not you think it's my job. It's just not. Try to avoid using anger, fear, guilt, and shame to control. Again, things that I do all the time. Last weekend, not this weekend, I had a conversation with my youngest, and I came into it believing that I was going to be able to do it. And within 15 minutes, I was shaming her. She left in tears. I came to apologize a couple of hours later in her bedroom, and she told me to get out. And I thought that makes sense. I betrayed her in a fundamental way again. But I did it out of my own woundedness, out of my own fears, out of my own issues. Try to avoid control. Control is kind of the last instinct in a chain of human experiences, right? It's fear and anger and control. If we know that the job is to raise a healthy self, first to be a healthy self and then to raise a healthy self, if we practice that mantra, practice that, surround yourselves, folks, as much as you can with people who know that. Go to Al-Anon, go to Adult Children of Alcoholics, go to Families Anonymous, find other people who have done their work. This week I'm hosting a Returning to You, we call it. That's our second in a series of intensives after Finding You. And I'm hosting one in person. And what I love about Returning to You is that everybody can be a tremendous support to each other because they don't have advice and answers for each other. They can just listen and support each other. Learn to ask for what you need. Right? I talk about I have things in the house that I want clean, and I'll say to my kids, it's because I'm neurotic or I'm OCD. It doesn't matter. I say those labels about neuroses and OCD not to demean myself, but to try to take the conversation out of the context of who's right. What's the right level of cleanliness that a parent should require in the house? I like this little technique too that I write in here. Ask for a hug from your teenagers rather than asking them if they want a hug or need a hug. You do it because, first of all, it models vulnerability, and second of all, it's hard for them to ask. It's hard for them to need. So you learn to take care of yourself. And so many people misinterpret this and said, well, if you're doing it for you, isn't that really them taking care of you? And the answer is no. When you're around somebody who can take care of themselves, even if it's not seen as an assertive move, it might look selfish, it might look unempathic. But one thing you learn about people that can take care of themselves is that you don't have to take care of them. And I don't think we do that enough with our children. I don't think we demonstrate enough that we can take care of ourselves, that we can find our own meaning in our life, our own happiness, our own serenity. I think we communicate to them pretty regularly that they're in charge of that. And that is crushing to them. I don't want to overstate this, but going back to what I said about 15 minutes ago, that's what we're treating at Evoke. We're treating children who believe that it's their responsibility, and in most cases, that they have ultimately failed at taking care of their parents. We learn that the world of feelings is enough on its own, and that our human limitations are okay. But what happens is, instead of my mother, for example, growing up, like most mothers, instead of talking about how she was overwhelmed, instead of talking about her limitations, she made me the bad one, right? I was a problem. So we have boundaries, we have limitations. Our children can deal with human parents. They have to. What they don't deal well with is with parents who think that they're right. That's really, really hard for children to deal with it. So as we establish boundaries, which come out of, see, as a therapist, I'm helping you be who you are, sort out your wounds, your defenses, all of that stuff. Out of that truth, that awareness comes boundaries. To have boundaries, we have to be willing to be wrong. We have to be willing to be hated or to let them be angry with us. We have to be willing to let other people down. I say this a lot lately. You have to be willing to drop the ball. Be willing to lose. Be willing to be alone. Be willing to be the bad one, the bad parent. Find your own mirror. And I don't want to preach to you like that parents that are trying to be their child's friends are abdicating their responsibility as a parent. I don't like that kind of talk because it's insulting, it's shaming. If you struggle in any of these areas, which I assume you do like me, it's because there's work to do. You have unhealed wounds to grapple with, just like every other human being on earth. We're willing to be alone. We're willing to be bad. We learn to find other places, other sources for our validation, not our children, not our children's accomplishments, successes, or failures. We find peers. We find a mentor. We find a therapist. We find a sponsor. We find parent groups. And all the while, our capacity to listen and to hear gets bigger and bigger. We start to heal our own narcissistic wounding, that it's not about us. They're not betraying us. They're struggling. They have a mental health issue. And it's not about us. It's about them. We learn to see their response as evidence of their mental health or illness. We learn to see their feelings and understand where those come from. And we learn to separate ourselves from their successes or failures. I will say this, I have to say this tonight. As a male, as a father in the world, I understand that our culture does not place the same kind of weight or expectations on my shoulders as it does women and mothers. I would like to say that we've advanced past that in our culture, but still, even in families where mother and father work, okay? Maybe even more so in families where both parents work. Even in families where the woman or the mother, if it's a male and a female relationship, even in those relationships, even if the mother works is the primary caregiver, our culture still assigns blame or credit to her. I mean, we just celebrated Mother's Day. You don't have to look very far to see of the angst and the turmoil surrounding motherhood today. So I understand that my value is as a professional, as a man in our culture still, primarily. So my detachment, I come to it a little easier than a woman in the context of the culture, but I still struggle with it. I can still relate to it. I just want to acknowledge that it can be more severe in our culture for women. A couple of cartoons. I guess this is the chapter on cartoons. The 3 stages of self-awareness. It's a cartoon called Savage Chickens from Doug Savage. Used with permission from Doug Savage. He has the 3 stages of self-awareness. The first stage, the first chicken says, "You're an idiot," and the second chicken says, "No." The second stage, the first chicken says, "You're an idiot," and the second chicken says, "Yes." And then the third stage is the second chicken just says, "I'm an idiot." You can pick your word. I've shared this poster that used to sit behind my therapist for many years. Something she had actually made herself called Words of Higher Enlightenment. It has lots of words and phrases like resign, fizzle, droop, release, sacrifice, wash out, moderate, rest, weaken, calm, break down, fail, quit, lose. And for years I would stare at this poster, this piece of art that stood behind her while she talked. And I realized after a while that these were what the enlightened person is able to accept in themselves, to see in themselves. That this is the side of us that we are told is ugly and unacceptable. But that the enlightened parent is able to acknowledge those parts, those aspects of themselves that they were told by their parents and the authority figures in their early life and the culture today that they should fear or avoid. So we learn to be an idiot parent. We learn to be imperfect, excuse me. We learn to be an imperfect human being. That's what that means. We learn to separate the cause and effect in our mind. You can only throw the ball. You can't force it into the glove. You can only love. You can only tell the truth. You can't force somebody to trust you. And then in the end, the journey of the heroic parent is about being a better person. Right? It's about the idea that being a better parent is being a better person, and it is its own reward. That we stop trying to be right. And then we learn that being ourselves is enough. And then we learn to separate ourselves and our feelings, to own them, and to not place them on other people. And that we're mindful of our I feel statements. That on the front and the back end, we communicate very clearly that it is not someone else's responsibility to make us feel good or right. I'm going to stand up because I want to read something from the end of the book before I close tonight. So excuse me for 30 seconds, 15 seconds. I want to end with this. Well, actually, That's in the next chapter. There's a 10th chapter. For a second, I thought there was only 9 chapters, but there's actually 10 chapters. So I'll include that in the next one. Sorry about that. I'm happy to take any live questions. Somebody asked how many people attend this weekly one. As of right now, there are 48 people. It varies between 25 and 80 people attend live. We get about 2,000 listens per day on the podcast. Someone says, how can I handle the situation when this friend of mine tells me what I should do when I share my struggles and I feel more anxious then because I feel she thinks I don't know what I should do? It's a great question. I mean, I think you can try to communicate what you've learned, and you don't have to convince her. You don't have to defend. Ultimately, you get to say, I don't want advice. When I share, I just want you to listen. And if she thinks that being a friend means that she has to give you advice, it's okay to say, I just have a different need than that. And if you can't do that, then I can't share with you. I mean, these are courageous, heroic, difficult conversations to have. Very, very difficult conversations to have. So you can try. She might not be able to hear it. Somebody writes, I am finally able to hear this message. Thank you for repeating that focusing on the co-parent is fruitless, that the best contribution we can make to our kids is to do our own work. You're welcome. I want to say this as we get close to the end of this book, just so I'm clear. Everything I write about, everything I teach about is connected to my own weaknesses. It's in part a discovery of my own flaws. Everything I offer to all of you is because I've been in therapy. I don't think I would have much to offer at all, no matter how much I studied, no matter how much I learned, if I hadn't been in therapy. So every chapter of this book and the second book and the third one that I'm writing, every bit of wisdom that I have to offer you, it touches on mistakes that I've made, wounds that I have. All I am is, what I give myself credit for is a courageous observer of my own humanity, my own woundedness, my own pathology, my own mental illness. Because I've worked on that so much, I can offer it back to you. And I don't think that the formal education that I received is the great strength. And I don't want to communicate that I have this all figured out. It is a work in progress. My job is hard. Like, it takes energy, it takes work. But the gift of my job is that when I give this broadcast, I'm teaching myself, I'm reminding myself. I walk out of this room. Every time I do one of these, I walk out of this room with a little bit of inspiration for trying to do better in the ways that I'm describing, which in the context of this broadcast include accepting the fact that I'm an nincompoop. Somebody says, can you differentiate boundaries from control or offer some examples? I was just discussing my 13-year-old and some of the things that we were looking for with her for this school year. The difference between a boundary and control is a boundary works every time. A boundary is what I need to feel okay as a dad, or as the executive clinical director at Evoke, or as the podcast host at Evoke, or whatever my role is, right? It's what I need. And if I say to my child, you can eat your chicken and your peas and have dessert, or you can't, I'm okay with either way. If you get these grades, you can have this privilege. I'm okay either way. Controlling is trying to get them to do the thing that I want them to do, to really having an agenda. So boundaries, we don't get to choose outcomes. We don't get to choose who shows up. I think as we set boundaries in our lives, all of us, I think we get to the point where, I know we get to the point where the better we get at boundaries, you're going to lose people. And you're going to gain some others. And some of the people in your life are going to rally, going to really, really rally and step up. And I don't know who is who in that equation. My experience is you lose people that surprise you, you gain people that surprise you, and the people that take it up, that step up to the next level, surprise you. Some are predictable in all three categories. So the difference between a boundary and control is a boundary is about taking care of yourself, and a boundary doesn't control for outcomes. A boundary is in its own right successful no matter what. Because if I say to you, if you yell at me, I'll leave, I'm not trying to get you to stop yelling. I just don't want you to yell at me. Okay, best example of a boundary. If I say to my alcoholic spouse, if you don't stop drinking and you don't go to treatment, I'm leaving. If I'm setting a healthy boundary, I'll say, you can keep drinking. I can't stop you. Heaven knows I've tried the first 15 years of our marriage to stop you, so I'm letting go of that. But I can tell you, I can't stay here if the drinking continues. And as painful as this is, I can live with either decision that you make. Somebody writes, I'm confused when you say boundaries are about them, children. I thought boundaries were supposed to be more about the parent. They are. I don't know where I said that. You're right. I can't seem to set any boundaries, somebody says, with my boss, who blames me in a distorted and harmful way. I don't defend myself, but I seem without any voice either to stop. Any suggestions? I'm going to give you might have to get a new job or tell your boss what your limits are. It's tough, right? That's why women don't leave their husbands that are abusing them physically. That's why we struggle with boundaries with our children. That's why we struggle with boundaries with the people that we care about, is we don't want to, in part, pay the cost of the boundary. And the cost of boundary is walking away, which could have financial, in this example, financial, but also have a lot of other social, relational implications. Boundaries are difficult. We often have to face the things that we fear the most, which is often internal, like the fact that I let somebody down, or that I'm not a good husband, or I'm not a good father, or a good friend, or a good employee, or a good therapist. I have to come face to face with I am not good to set a boundary. Because boundaries aren't that complicated. We're not really confused. We just don't want to, or are terrified of looking at that thing. And sometimes it's very practical, like in the last question with money and a boss. The outcome is you might not have your job. I've had to make decisions as a business person that cost me money, but that were healthy boundaries for my mental health. That's difficult. Somebody writes, do you think your personal observations, which I agree with, are backed by research? You mentioned attachment theory, but are there other studies and theories that you use? Lots and lots and lots of theories and research, yes. Attachment theory is the primary one. Yes, I think my observations are absolutely grounded in research. Motivational interviewing, parenting from the inside out are two great examples of what I'm teaching tonight that ground themselves in research prolifically. Motivational interviewing is a great example. It has hundreds of articles that they cite to make the points I'm making tonight. Parenting from the inside out is a very nurturing and clear explanation of what I'm talking about. And Dr. Siegel, Dan Siegel, whom some of you might know, he's the one that grounds it and ties it to the research. But yes. But the most important evidence is that you feel it. You know what I'm teaching is true because you can feel it. It might be confusing to some of you that are new. I admit that. But you sense that there's something there, that you're hearing something different, that it's not the same old advice. But the evidence that I have is that I feel it in my life. And most of the stuff that I teach, people will say to me, I didn't know it before you said it, but the minute you said it, it made sense. All right, wrapping up. My books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are on Amazon, also on Audible. I did the second book in my own voice. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, you can do an intensive with us. June 9th through 13th is the next one. I'm running an in-person one this week, part 2, called Returning to You Now. You can also do it online. It's cheaper. It's a little bit easier on your schedule. So we also have these intensives available online. It basically looks at your family of origin, your early context, and shows you how that's playing out in your current relationships, especially in many cases with your children, although it's not limited to parents. We have adventure trips for families and young adults. You can use them between programs or after programs. Just go to our website and look at our pursuits programs. We have support groups for current and alumni parents of our wilderness program. The next one is May 13th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And then our intensives alumni group is on May 11th. That's tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Just contact Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information. On social media, all of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You in Evoke Therapy Podcast or go to soundcloud.com. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy or at Evoke Therapy Intensives on Instagram. On Facebook, find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And also our blog on our website has new content each week. I'm going to be taking a week off next week. I have an intensive the rest of the week. I have to finish my book, which was given the thumbs up by my publisher. So I'll be doing that next week. So I won't be hosting any of these for a little bit of time. Maybe I can get one of our therapists to do a guest spot for us. But in the meantime, you have our library you can go to. I hope these are helpful points of contact. Thank you for joining me this evening. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.